Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Nina Bandelj. I'm a professor at the University of California, Irvine. I'm an economic sociologist.
And Prof, I wanted to begin by asking you what I ask pretty much everybody, namely, would you share with us what's currently preoccupying, impeding, interesting, dynamizing you? What's going on for the Prof?
I think about money and I think about emotions a lot. So these could be very personal, but they're very much linked to what I do as an economic sociologist. I like to say that I love money, obviously, to pique people's interest, but I love money not for the obvious reasons. I think it tells us a lot about people. And so it is a subject that somebody who's interested in why people do the things they do is a very interesting one. A unique one, because most people think that money and economy is somehow absent of social relations or emotions or values. But we try to dismantle that myth, that common conception of separation between economy and society. And why I think about emotions is that I think they're everywhere these days.
Mm-hmm.
So I think about how emotions are a currency and how this currency has appreciated recently, and how emotionalization of life more broadly has come to dominate a lot of areas of life, including economy. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about that, because again, people don't necessarily think about emotions and economy at the same time.
I can see a couple of dead white European men circling me, one named Simmel, the other one named Weber.
Right.
Am I right to see them circling me?
Well, you are right to see Weber recircling me recently. I was coming back. I will be teaching in my economic sociology graduate seminar a class, a session next week on culture, morality, and economy. And of course, we're going to read from the Protestant ethic and how has been an elective affinity, as Weber says, between uh, a Calvinist Protestant ethic of engagement in work and capitalism. But Weber has also circled back with this notion of the iron cage.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that, of course, over centuries, societies have become more rational, less enchanted, if you'd like, right? The Entzauberung, the taking away the enchantment from life and making it more rational, is something that Weber would add to our conversation if he were circling around. But I've been asking myself to what extent economy has become re-enchanted. So, Wiederverzauberung, if you would, and how these emotional economies have come to achieve their prominence, where we are not only sort of exchanging in monetary income, but also something that economists long time ago called psychic income.
Now, Prof. B, I'm thinking here also of the way in which neoclassical economics has tried to revise itself with all its shortcomings in concert with psychology and sometimes geography, and is endeavoring to accept that not all actions are the product of ratiocinative consumption, there are things called emotions, there's a thing called religion, all kinds of cultural norms that actually get in the way of the idea that we're constantly engaging in maximization of utility. So I want to talk about your forthcoming book in a second, but before we get there, can you talk a little bit about where the rational consumer model that's been sovereign in so much of economic thought recently fits in with economic sociology or doesn't, and your concern with feelings, emotions?
Absolutely. Great point to add, if it does fit or if it doesn't, because for a long time, economic sociologists have really tried to differentiate ourselves. We have tried to differentiate ourselves from the neoclassical model, always sort of as a shadow in the background, a towering figure, and how we need to add social context to understand what people actually do in the economy. That it's not a matter of abstract models, and it's not even a matter of a parsimonious explanation, which I think behavioral economists, for instance, have tried to push forward with. So to make it more realistic, but nevertheless within the constraints of rational action. So I would say that behavioral economists have put bounds to that rational action, as you yourself mentioned, taking into account emotions, let's say, and taking into account people's values, or anything that could be put into the maximizing equation, right? Bounded rationality, not synoptic rationality, as they would say. But it is from the individual standpoint. And I think this is where economic sociologists really depart. Not only are we adding emotions and values, social forces, but we're really bringing in a relational perspective. And that is that people engage with others in economic lives. And so to think from an individual standpoint, what is called individualist methodological individualism is really not the starting point that we share. So we could add that context, but I think for behavioral economists, it's just context. For us, really is an alternative way to think about how economic life proceeds.
This is where I'd like to raise, if I could, your forthcoming book, and then which obviously encompasses some of these themes. I've not read it because it's coming out in January, and we're speaking right at the end of October. It's called Overinvested: The Emotional Economy of Modern Parenting. And I can see you sitting on NBC's Today couch in a few weeks, being interrogated about this and being told that you have 45 seconds to answer, having flown to their New York studios economy from Southern California. But I have read some of your wonderful essays, both individual and collective, about parenting, children, money. So without sharing everything that you'll share in your 45 seconds on the Today Show, what's the scoop, Prof? What's the book about?
So the book is called Overinvested, and it's subtitled The Emotional Economy of Modern Parenting. It's about how we turned children into investment projects and how we turned child rearing into exhausting labor, and basically why that's a bad idea.
And you've interviewed, along with your team, a lot of people to try to ground this not only in existing academic empirical research and your theoretical orientation, but what people tell you. What did they tell you, and what did you guys observe?
So that was a big part, was to listen to parents, 120 parents, and I'm very grateful to everyone's participation. Perhaps they wanted to talk to somebody because parents are exhausted. They just love their children. They want to do everything for their children. So if the parents we talk to have something in common, this is what they have in common. Even if they come, the group that we managed to talk to is a very diverse group of people from all walks of life, across economic backgrounds, where they come from. First generation immigrants have been in the United States for generations, from different racial backgrounds, moms and dads, so of different religious persuasions, of different political persuasions. And so it is reflective of the big country that the US is in its diversity. But they have this in common. They have this concern with children in common. And maybe one last thing that we can all talk about was love for children. But to what extent they believe it is their sole responsibility to take care of their children, not only to provide for them, but to really invest emotions and, very importantly, money. To raise children these days in the US means devoting a lot of financial resources. And for some, this is much more readily available. And for many, most people go into debt, for instance, to be able to do what they believe they should for their children. We have what I say, privatized child rearing. So this idea of privatized child rearing is one of the core orienting sociological contributions to our understanding of parenting. Sociologists, of course, have talked about parenting in a lot of ways. There's family sociology, a field that is very strong, and I will never claim to even know a tiny bit of what that knowledge provides. So where I come at this is as an economic sociologist to see what does things that parents do economically. They invest, they save, they spend money, and they take on debt. What does that tell us about not only parenting, but our society? And that shouldering of these burdens for raising the new generation, let's be straightforward, it's on parents. And that's where the requirement to be overinvested comes from, and where we need to lessen the burdens.
How is this different from 150, 30 years ago? How do you know it's different?
Excellent question. Parents have always been exhausted, right? It's been exhausting to raise kids. Anyone who has been waking up in the middle of the night and, or is worrying about how to manage a schedule with a few children who need to be at too many places at the same time. So I would say that how it's different is in three ways. One is this money, right? The amount of money that is required to mostly invest in our children's education. So it's not true that the costs of raising children across the board have increased. That is important to point out, because when we say children are expensive these days, and we do actually pose this as a claim to our parents who we talk to reflect upon, right? So people say it's expensive to raise children these days. What do you think about that? And what they tell us is not that it's expensive across the board, but how much they worry they need to invest into children's education in particular. So if we look more broadly, and of course, as sociologists here, we listen to parents, but I also analyzed longitudinal data sets. So to be able to get a picture of this longer term trajectory that you were asking me about, how is this different? And if we only took a snapshot of, for instance, how much parents spent on education and childcare in 1995 compared to 2015, so in a span of only a few decades, it's eightfold more between these two time periods. And that has to do with the increasing cost of childcare and increasing cost of college and increasing cost of extracurricular activities. And just as an interesting little point in how sociology of knowledge tells us something about cultural change. In 2009, the Consumer Expenditure Survey, which is a big data collection effort that tracks what people do and how they spend and what households do with money, added a category on tutoring expenses in addition to extracurricular activities, leisure, clubs and soccer and dance, etc., which has been a prevalent theme on, kind of the parents' minds for decades, especially after Annette Leroux, a famous sociologist, wrote about how middle and upper class parents focus on concerted cultivation. What does that mean? Like scheduling children's time, right? Right. So that is still very prevalent. But what I add is the amount of money and how intense financially this is. That's one. Sorry, it's a lot of money. That's why the answer was long. The other two will be slightly shorter. Two other points are about emotions. And I said money and emotions are on my mind. And
Mm.
one is how much emotional well-being of children has become prominent. So another little tidbit is if you ask parents, what is different from how you were raised compared to how you're raising your children? It's not values, it's not discipline, it's not religion, um, it's relationship between a parent and a child, and the loving relationship between a parent and child that they want to um, cultivate, they want to have. So most parents say, three-quarters of parents say it's different how they are raising their children compared to how they were raised. So, you know, emotional work, but about emotions and emotional well-being of children, and it's moms who are the emotional managers mostly along those lines. The third part in how this is different is just that it's not really only about children, it's about what parents think they should do to be good parents. So there's a slight difference here, right? We care about children and it's effort oriented toward children, money, and emotions. But then we also care about our identities as good parents.
Mm.
And that culture and media and social platforms and all this messaging and parenting manuals have elevated the importance of being a parent as almost a master identity status for those who are parents that in some ways overpowers other identities that we carry and other preoccupations we have. So that is different. And as a cultural analyst yourself, right, you might agree with me that tracking how cultural messages that are coming to parents may be different today because of all the media that are out there. And we analyzed about 100 books, and those books turned to be more about parenting as opposed to child rearing, in a sense, child focused and parent oriented. So maybe you have something to interject with since I've spoken quite some now.
No, that was great. I'm thinking of Dr. Spock and all the
Yes.
different iterations of that book and the, I guess, millions of copies that it sold, and how I remember there was, oh my God, it's a bit thicker than I remember. Dr. Benjamin Spock.
Well, there are 18 editions. I don't know how many, but absolutely, right? The Bible was called the
Mm.
Bible, Parenting Bible, 1946. And in many ways, if you read chapter 2 of the book, of my book, it starts with Dr. Benjamin Spock and how parents really should be concerned about emotional well-being of their children. So I do trace that theme about emotions to Benjamin Spock and many others who picked up after, mostly not even doctors, pediatricians. He was a pediatrician, but not even psychologists or experts with MDs or PhDs, but observers of social life, journalists, mothers themselves who've written memoirs. I think some listeners may remember a lot of discussion around Dr. Amy Chua, who's a law professor at the Yale School of Law, who didn't write about law, her expertise scholarly, but about her experience as a mother, a tiger mom, right, of two children. And that book received a lot of attention. That was around 2011. And after that, several other books, including, Jennifer Senior's, she's a journalist, in 2014, this book, All Joy and No Fun, The Paradox of Modern Parenting, came out, that oriented folks around how children impact parents, not only how parents influence children.
Yes, a great pity, but Amy Chua's first book, much better one, World on Fire, didn't get the same attention. It's infinitely more interesting and inventive and provocative. But in any event, yes, that raises the question of different parenting styles depending on cultural backgrounds and norms, and investment in the idea of education, obviously, but also tough parenting. And it seems to me that in the domain of pop psychology, pop parenting, there are fashions that come and go. And this is partly not so much to do with research, but publishers looking for something at the margins economically to innovate. The same with self-help literature, where there are only marginal changes, or new forms of doing yoga. These are just marginal changes around a core, and often driven by secondary accumulation.
Well, sometimes driven by nowadays a viral post, right? Something that goes viral, has one idea, and then there's an agent who might approach an author to write a book about this.
Boom, you go.
Because it already has an audience potentially that could purchase a thicker volume on a particular idea that has widely circulated.
You've already mentioned gender a bit, and this seems to me obviously pretty crucial here. I'm thinking of The Second Shift and other classics that emphasize some of the differences between, in conventional heterosexual undertakings, as it were, male and female parenting. And here, one of the themes that I certainly see when I read the New York Times or the Guardian, not when I read The Economist or the FT, is women feeling guilty. Guilty for not having children, guilty for having children, guilty for working too much. And this question of exhaustion that you raise, it does seem still to be very different in those heterosexual arrangements. So I wondered if you could talk about that, and also what happens with queer parenting, two women, two men, and of course, single parenting, which is a very big deal.
Yes.
Whether that's something that was planned and was always the case, or that emerges due to death or divorce.
Right. Let's just be very clear that there are various family forms, and that the book does not do justice to interrogating lives of these different family formations as much as it could if it paid more direct and strategic attention to that dimension of comparison. We do have about 20% of single parents, mostly because the recruitment of trying to reach parents and who was willing to talk brought those families to us, and those are mostly single moms. I think maybe a couple of single fathers. And I would say other research by my colleagues, in particular, a recent book that came out just a couple months ago by Alison Deminger on the mental load, is an excellent case in where she compares heterosexual couples where not only work related to children happens, but more broadly conceived cognitive labor about household tasks. This is her a book, Cognitive Labor is the main concept, and I think the title is What's on Her Mind, and how does that differ from queer families? So please read that for that dimension. I would say that where you were really touching something that's very strong in our interviews is the mom guilt, right?
Mm.
So there's
Mm.
even the phrase mom guilt that's circulating in popular media. What we heard about is how deeply felt it is. And it's sort of heartbreaking, right? Because we would imagine that somehow that guilt might have dissipated. Women work, have jobs. This is not so much about having to spend time in the workforce and would like to spend time with children, because that's the normal life these days. It's to have a career and family, but it's how am I the best supporter of my children emotionally, and am I a good mom? You know, that question that is so present whenever we pick up a phone with all the messaging that's out there. There's a book also really interesting by journalist Sarah Peterson on momfluenced, so all the social influencers that are moms, and how that is, you know, it's wonderful, we see it, we want to escape to it, but to what extent it also shapes our subjectivity with sort of this um, constant, even if it's invisible, pressure to perform in a certain way. So I think we have what I call mom's impossible jobs, when we have pushed even further what it means to be a good mom and kind of lowered people's understanding of what it takes to achieve it. So that gap, right, is the one that creates that feeling of guilt.
So, Prof B, I have two more questions about the book, if I may, and then on to for you.
Go ahead.
But before we call it a day, the first question is, what did you find out that surprised you?
Yeah, great question. I will have to pick just a few things.
Yeah.
But I would say this focus on um, well, money that is spent on education in particular. So I came to the project thinking through a money lens, but it was mostly just being fascinated how parents have to go into debt to raise children. That to me seemed really curious, right? And who is that? And how come that parents would need to take on debt to raise children? Is that different? Has that changed over time? So for a long time, and I should acknowledge that the National Science Foundation supported this project, and that was very crucial. Especially in the debates of how important funding is for any kind of research. I do need to mention that. So it was called something like Raising Children, Rising Debt, right? To kind of interrogate that connection. And it's true that mostly debt for college that parents take on has increased substantially. We all know about the college debt crisis. We mostly think about college students who carry these loan burdens, but it's actually since 2010 that amounts that parents have in debt for their children that have surpassed what individuals carry themselves. It's mostly because there's a cap on student loans, but there's no cap in how parents try to even be inventive sometimes, right? The second mortgage on the house or a private loan, not just the federal loans that the state provides, which are those plus loans called parent loans for undergraduate students. So those have absolutely increased. But not only that, they vary across race and class. And so I think we've seen how racialized this debt is. And it means that only a certain segment of the families in some ways leverages this money for future generations' mobility, and others may in fact undermine their position when they're trying to do the best for their children to succeed. So that's one. It's on that. The other one is on the opposite end. It's rich parents. The top third spends these days 8 times more. Let me see, because I did think you might want to ask me that question, and I was thinking it would be probably more persuasive if I were to able to mention those figures. So if we compare between 1995 and 2015, the top third in income is spending 3 times more money on education, which for 15 to 17-year-olds. So that's the important part, right? We all know that, all know a lot of discussion about how expensive it is to put children in childcare when they're little. But the fact that we have now created an industry around investment before college, that has really surprised me, and how that has grown and how much it is compared to what low-income families can afford. So we're talking about, a few $100s per year, let's say, by low-income families, and that we're talking more than $6,000 per year for an average well-to-do family. That is, a scale of 8 times more, and even more so. And it has consequences, feeds into our understanding of our society becoming increasingly economically unequal. And the economic inequality is not increasing across the board. It is growing the fastest among families with children. So these figures help put that in perspective.
So my last question on the book is, what do you want?
Right. I'm a sociologist. So even though it's tempting to say I have advice and I have policy advice, if anything, I would like to help people understand how individual issues fit into broader social problems, and that parenting today is somewhat of a public crisis. It's not an individual problem, and that if parents who take this on to themselves start to think how much we, by doing differently, can help to change social norms around parenting, then maybe even pressure on what states could do to help us reimagine parenting and reimagine children might move further along. People absolutely agree across political lines that we should do more to help working parents, that we should have childcare, that's more affordable, that doesn't cost 50% of household income if you have 2 children in certain expensive states. I mean, that is just not sustainable. And we have also come to see after the pandemic that it's almost a crisis in public health. In fact, US Surgeon General in 2014 issued a report calling well-being of parents and how poor it is as a public health crisis. So it's not an individual problem. It's very much about society. And as a sociologist, I have helped to shed light. I help possibly for us to start rethinking how our actions contribute to our broader societal trends.
Well, that leads very helpfully onto some questions I wanted to pose about economic sociology itself, and in particular, something that you've just touched on, I think, which is relationality and the notion of intimacy, economy through relations, transactions, exchanges. We have a current president who is being spoken of all the time as transactional.
Right.
There are various other adjectives I might choose, but is there an increase? Is there some sort of change here going on? And what is it about relational networks that seems so important to economic sociologists?
So it's really important to understand a little bit of how this whole subfield of economic sociology, especially in the US, uh, emerged back on the scene after big writers that we started with, Simmel and Weber and Marx and Durkheim, wrote about the economy, the political economy. So those were the foundations of sociology. But for a long time, we stepped away and sort of um, left value to economists and thought of values as something really that is sociological. So in 1985, a Stanford professor, Mark Grenovetter, published a very important article that highlighted how social relations are really important to economic action. And so that piece has been cited many, many times. One of the most cited pieces in not only economic sociology, but generally in social sciences, because it was inspiring to computer scientists, to people working in STEM, thinking about relations between units as important, not only sort of atoms and identities. And so that has received a lot of resonance. And moving from that was a natural step to think, well, is it just the structure of relations? One of the key arguments of Grenovetter was the strength of weak ties. What does that mean? That it depends how your network is structured for you to be able to or not benefit from it, such as getting a job, let's say. And people have been researching this for a long time, including with very sophisticated social network methods. So the move in the field was to add content and add dynamism and add relationality as it is enacted in action to this understanding of economic behavior with the concept of relational work. So this was mostly due to brilliant scholarship of Viviana Zelizer, professor at Princeton, who interrogated economic processes in intimate spheres and suggested that there's a lot of economy even in intimacy. These are not two separate spheres. They don't necessarily corrupt each other. So let's think about connected lives of economy and intimacy. So that relational work means that we match, right? We match different kinds of monies even, or gifts or payments to different kinds of relationships. And so in my book, what parents do really is relational work. They think about how they would express this connection, this sacred bond to their children. So money here absolutely affirms. It does not corrupt, as some people might think. When you believe when money gets involved, bad things will happen. Money is the root of all evil, etc. So we dismantle that notion. Now the question is, to what extent our thinking in society has moved into simply embracing that transactionality is something that is okay, and we can bargain in any sphere. We can kind of use personal persuasion to get things done, even if this is a political environment where norms were put in place previously. I think that is unprecedented in many ways, right? And maybe highlights processes that sociologists have described on a much more visible and in some ways shocking manner. Now, I should add that by putting them so much on display, it also normalizes them. So we come back, right, to emotions and money, and to what extent now it's simply okay to be so provocative, to be bold, to do what you feel like, even in very formal political or economic engagements.
And Prof, it made me think of the Bible, the Christian Bible, a moment ago, because you described the connection between children and parents as a sacred bond. And B, you mentioned money is the root of all evil, which of course in this Christian Bible, it's love of money is the root of all evil. So it's too much desire. And I wondered about religion in all of this, in the parenting domain. And I wondered about love as something that, yes, might be indexed financially or incarnate financially, but might transcend that kind of exchange into something also material, but more bodily.
Mhm. So I'll try to respond to some thoughts. I'm pretty sure you have some others that maybe were on your mind when you asked that question. Uh, Religion, I think, is a big, important subject these days. We've seen, the rise of Christian nationalism. Sociologists have written about that. In some ways, religion, in various forms, has also been present in corporate life. There's a book by Carolyn Chen, a Berkeley sociologist, who talks about religion and the Silicon Valley. I think it's called it's not Eat, Pray, Love, and the movie, and Elizabeth Gilbert's a novelist, but it's something around work, code, pray, and
Work,
that
work,
prayer.
work, pray code.
Exactly, thank you, so that listeners can find it and read it. And so I think that's part of that enchantment, yet again, right, of life I started with, in which we seek, even in spheres where we think they're quite sterile or objective or devoid of feelings and religious sentiment, infusion of those, and in some ways perhaps use it to inspire or exploit workers to put all their selves into their jobs. So that's an interesting way in which one could think about religion and the economy today. It's not necessarily something that I did in the book, but I believe it's absolutely worth of its attention moving forward. Like, just imagine mindfulness has become a corporate practice in the past couple of decades, right? The Silicon Valley put together a program called Search Within Yourself, or that brought Buddhist principles into Google's work lives. So that's something quite intricate to explore, for instance.
About 8 years ago, I was one of several hundred social scientists that Facebook invited to its campus to talk about the future.
Love that. You have to tell us more.
Well, we had to sign non-disclosure agreements. We were not told about this until we got there, but since I have no future with Facebook, and Facebook is not being regarded well by investors as of yesterday, I'll take a risk. Very quickly, it's that the place was laden with appalling, absurd, quasi-religious, pop psychology imbrications to do better. This included on the door, the inside of the doors of the men's toilets, with remarks like "push harder," not as some sort of off-color joke, but literally with a list of items that needed to be focused on for that week. Really
Incredible.
horrible. And they're all over the world now. So, for example, where I work, at least they're in Spanish, but where I live, they're all in English, and they're all over
Mm.
the tower that I live,
Mhm.
even though people there don't speak English, they speak Spanish. And they're all about be a better you, discover your future, take control of your life, all these sorts of requirements that are very Protestant in lots of ways, can certainly relate to the evangelical imposts that have become florid and powerful, but are also part of making work religious, I think.
Absolutely. So that's the important part, right? It's to ask to what extent this embraces a whole of a person's life and allows them for self-expression, or in fact harnesses people's personal lives for the capitalist machine.
And where there's no moment to switch off.
Exactly.
So
But
perhaps,
you don't feel bad about it, right? That's the tricky part.
well, because you're investing in yourself,
Exactly, exactly.
it'll all be
It's the
fine.
psychic income, right? That's so important
It's
in these emotional economies.
it's Gary Becker crawling down the back of my t-shirt, and I can't get him out before he bites me with his evil venom.
So do not read chapter 1 and 3 of my book because Gary Becker is all over there.
Well, that's what I mean. Once he's got inside your t-shirt, Prof, you can't get him out. He has that
Well,
great,
absolutely. He himself says his ideas have mushroomed, and we know mushrooms are, they are the ones that have an easy way to get all over the place through tiny nooks and crannies.
and you've got to work out which ones are poisonous and which are not.
I like that. Absolutely.
Mm. Prof, I had one more question for you, if I may, and
Please.
it's on a different topic, but one that you and I
Sure.
briefly discussed before we started recording. And then I'd like, once you've answered that, to give you the opportunity to add anything you may wish. Now, that could involve something entirely new that we haven't touched on. You've published on so many themes with such profundity that I may have missed them, or it might be something where we have debated things, but where you want to traverse that terrain again. Does that sound all right as a means of bringing things to a close?
Sounds all right and very fair. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. So my last question is about immigration, which, as you said to me before we started taping, or whatever the right word is nowadays, is very much a topic of the here and now, but one that you've published on a bit in the past. And one of the areas that's dragging a lot of people into a moment of sadness, it's what's happening in the United States, but also what's happening in Europe.
Exactly.
So yesterday, it seems as though the particular hatreds of Geert Wilders did not succeed in the Netherlands in the election. And a party that everybody else calls the centre-right, but the New York Times thinks is centre-left, has done quite well. No doubt in the New York Times terms, it is centre-left. We've seen grotesque forms of nationalism emergent in Hungary and in Britain and in France, and what I call grotesque forms of nationalism. And of course, we're seeing a huge struggle in Spain, and perhaps in Germany, seeing something that was once thought of as the province of what was East Germany and of being the province of older people, now being much more common and common amongst young people too. Mm-hmm. So, not asking you to explain all of that, but I'm conscious that you did some comparative research on attitudes in Eastern Europe to immigration, and wondered if you might talk about that along with anything else you want to say more generally. Because my guess is, from your accent, that like me, you're a migrant. So that's part of it.
Absolutely.
That's part of it for us, isn't it?
It is. And come from Eastern Europe. So this research was very much linked to thinking about what's happening in the region where I grew up, seeing that countries in Eastern Europe expressed such strong anti-immigrant sentiments that were even higher than other places in the world. And that was a big puzzle. We were trying to understand, how come that is, especially because societies have changed. And the idea was that people will be better off, or at least people will get opportunities to, outside of kind of oppressive state structures, realize their potential, so to speak, right? Um, but and so why would there be so much hatred? So not just dislike, but also just not envisioning any sort of relations with people who come from other countries. Um, and these dimensions, of course, of differentiation fall along religious lines as well, fall along racial lines. In Eastern Europe, those are not so pronounced, but are certainly there. And I think in the Europe as a whole, those are all interrelated. One of the explanations we go to is to compare, right, how people think of their lives before socialism collapsed and how they think of them after, and what economic systems they believe bring good life to them. Uh, and people were disillusioned, very much disillusioned with the capitalist and market system, that it's those people who were disillusioned who held stronger anti-immigrant sentiments. And it's, if you think about it very basically, how in a market system you are pushed to think as an individual. There's no state one needs to rely on. So whoever gets something, right, might be taking away from you. That's one of the arguments that Arlie Hochschild has been making in trying to understand the situation in the US, and how people believe you stand in line, but there are others who bypass you and they're just not deserving. And who is deserving is one who looks like you, one who tries as hard as you try. Once you have these very basic divisions put in place, it's very easy to find those who you think are undeserving and who you should, absolutely differentiate from. And that easily, now that we're in these emotional economies that I talked about, turns into hate that is very uh, 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 openly expressed, because there's no reservations anymore as to what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. Not to say that this is the only reason in why we have expressions of strong feelings and even violence in populism, but very basically, if individuals are there to fight for themselves, and if it's okay to just fight openly and violently, then we will see those fights take place on our streets.
This is the irony, isn't it? That ethno-nationalism is so invested in the idea of a religious, linguistic, genetic purity that is so rarely the case in these countries, most spectacularly the United States, but nevertheless is invoked all the time. The Supreme Court saying, yes, you can arrest people for speaking Spanish in the street or at work. They
That's
might
right. That's not discrimination.
undocumented.
That's not racial profiling. It's rational action. You're
Yeah,
taking the signal.
yeah. God.
Um,
And I
very
found,
tough, very tough issues.
when I lived in Britain,
I'm
sorry, go ahead.
no, just to say that there's very little one feels it's adequate to say about those, but I'm glad you brought them up, simply to say they're really important ones for our society to wrestle with.
I think so. And it just goes on and on and on in the most demoralizing way. To finish up, Prof, I wanted to turn, as I said, to that opportunity for you to add something. And as I indicated, it could be something that retraces our steps, or it might be something that we haven't addressed.
Well, thank you so much. I may just use the opportunity to express my gratitude to you. I look forward to reading more of your work on cultural analysis. I wish we had time to talk about, global Hollywood, which is something you wrote about, and has absolutely seemed to be appealing to broader audiences. You know, what is globalization? What is the backlash to globalization? Those are important themes as well to consider. But a little self-servingly, yes, my book is coming out in January, right?
Hey,
So thank you for giving me a chance to talk about it ahead of time. And Princeton University Press will publish it on January 20th. I look forward to hearing what people have to say about it. I worked on it for 10 years. So, you know, this baby is absolutely overinvested.
well,
Um,
Prof, when you've had a few months of responses, I'd love to invite you back into the pod to record another episode to talk about what it was like going on with Today's Show, what it was like
well,
getting
you
influencers
are
contacting you, and so on.
very generous. Absolutely up. And let's be in touch about it.
Great. Many thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Miller, for this conversation.